Chapter the next. Maundy Thursday. The processes of all creative force are complicated, tortuous, and arbitrary. They are also infinitely various. The simple notion of any one single vital urge displaying itself in spontaneous generation from inorganic matter and then thrusting forth, in its chemical transmutations, all the astounding forms of evolutionary life, does not cover one half of the dark continents of real creation. None knoweth the beginning of things, but under the anarchy of present existence are galaxies of warring minds. The immense future depends upon the wills of multitudinous hosts of minds, but not, alas, upon well-meaning, tender, indulgent, generous, forgiving, considerate, man-loving minds. The mind of the first cause was twofold, self-contradictory, divided against itself. The multifarious minds that stir up the chemistry of matter today are all descended from the first cause and share its dualistic nature, its mingling of abominable cruelty with magnanimous consideration. Many of these minds have far more simple goodness in them, more simple pity, more simple tenderness, than the double-edged mind of the first cause. But none are reliable, none can be trusted. While none of them are entirely evil, none are entirely good. There's no creative energy divorced from some level either high or low of what we call consciousness. And there's no consciousness, whether of demiurge, demon, angel, elf, elemental, planetary spirit, demigod, wraith, phantasm, sun, moon, earth, or star, which is not composed of both good and evil. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening of the same Maundy Thursday when John had the vision, if such it were, of Arthur's sword at Pomperlus Bridge, that a company of cheerful human beings were gathered together, snug and warm, full of chittering gossip, full of lively hummings and buzzings of released roguery, in the kitchen, scullery, and museum of Glastonbury Vicarage. Matt Decker's high church doctrines had always been a nature to admit large, generous, and even eccentric undertakings. And on this eve of the anniversary of his mean god's cruel death, he had seen fit to give to the inner circle of his parishioners what he was pleased to demonize as to denominate as the choir supper. This name was absurdly inappropriate, for most of the best actual singers in St. John's Church were uninvited to the homely and secular feast. Homely secular feast. Maybe if I get closer, I'll be able to read it better. They were uninvited because they would have refused to come. They were of the type of Anglican piety that regards fasting rather than feasting as appropriate to the eve of the crucifixion. Matt Decker, although fully as Catholic in his dogmas as his most austere parishioner, had the natural, easygoing earthiness of an old-fashioned French curé. There was something in the deepest part of his spirit that the word homely could alone describe. He loved little, ordinary, negligible things, little, ordinary events, little, casual objects in nature. This choir supper, on the eve of Good Friday, would have not interfere with the humble devotion with which he would labor, patiently and solemnly, through the long invocations and applications of the morrow's service. But there was something about it that peculiarly satisfied Matt Decker's whole personality. He took a profound but perhaps quite unconscious delight in the various degrees of glowing idiosyncrasy which illuminated the physiognomies of his guests. It was indeed a scene worthy of Teniers or Jane Steen or Bruegel, John Steen, the choir supper of Glastonbury Vicarage. The center of it was the kitchen, where Penny Pritches, standing at her famous and ancient stove, played the part of the arch-sorceress of the occasion. On an old nursery chair with a low wicker seat was seated, next to the stove, the portly form of Mr. Weatherwax. The forehead of Mr. Weatherwax's shone with amiability and heat. He had found a corner of the great stove, which was really like a world in itself, where he could deposit his glass of brandy. His enormous face at the low level, and exposed to periodic emissions of extreme heat from the oven, looked larger than human there. He looked like a colossal gnome or goblin present at the cooking of an ogre's meal. Indeed, when Penny placed a special morsel from some dainty dish upon a plate on his lap, he looked, as it must be confessed, like the ogre himself. Moving about with the dishes in support of Penny were quite a phalanx of serving maids, all of them with their Sunday clothes on, but covered up in big loose overalls. Sally Jones was here, and Tossie Stickles. Lily and Louie Rogers were here. You remember them, don't you? I don't. Even the redoubtable Emma Sly, as an especial honor to Mr. Decker, who was her favorite official in the town, was among these amateur and yet these professional ministrants. Now I'm going to just pause here for a second, look at the table of casts in the beginning, and see if we can figure out who these people are, because I don't remember. Lily and Louie Rogers, that's the names, right? I just said. Yeah, who were they? Sisters, housemaid and cook at Miss Drew's. Now, who is Miss Drew again? Euphemia Drew, elderly spinster and Mary Crow's employer. Okay. That's all coming back to me now. Tossie Stickles is Elizabeth Drew's servant. Nancy Stickles is a devoted disciple of Mr. Geard. Alright, and Emma Sly is... Who's Emma Sly again? Let's see that name in here. Abel Twig, John Geard, Megan, Cordelia, Philip Crow, Tilly, John and Mary Crow, Elizabeth Crow, Persephone Spear, Dave Fernandez, Makia P, Lady Rachel, Edward, Euphemia Drew, Tom Barter, Owen Evans, Decker, Sam Decker, Dr. Barbara, Titty, Red, Nancy, Penny, Abel Twig, Isaac Weatherwax, Lindsay and Lou, Tossie Stickles, Nancy Stickles, Mother Leg, Young Toosie, Ben Chadwick, Jenny Morgan, Morgan Nelly, Phil Toller, Ellen Cantle, Paul Trent, John Beer, Angela Beer, Jackie Jones, Sis, Bert Cole. No, I don't see Emma Sly in there, but maybe that's a nickname for somebody. Anyway, I've wasted enough time doing that. Let no humorous adept in the whimsicalities of human manners think that there were any fewer exquisite morsels of class distinction, of character distinction, of distinction in social prestige in this group of Glastonbury servants than there would be when Tilly Crow, up at the Elms, gave her next grand tea party to their mistresses. Emma, of course, was the grande dame of the occasion. Okay. That's a person I don't know who it is. But this, by reason of Emma's long training in the diplomacy of parties, proved quite an impossible task. The little elderly woman was the only one of the servants there who dressed would have been appropriate if they had all been suddenly summoned to carry tea trays into the drawing room. And it was not her ordinary service dress. Its quietness and modesty retained somewhat about it, perhaps in a tiny piece of dark blue ribbon around Emma's neck, the impression that it was put on to do especial honor to somebody or something outside the routine of her diurnal labors. That touch of blue around Emma's neck was a delicate intimation that the great professional was an amateur that night. It had doubtless been put on partly in honor of tomorrow's being Good Friday and partly in honor of Matt Decker's being Emma's vicar. The roguish blue eyes of Sally Jones were always flinging furtive glances of mischievous girlish understanding into the soft, dark brown, lethargic eyes, constantly growing misty and tender, self-conscious sentiments when her friend teased her about Mr. Barter or Tossie Stickles. Tossie was undoubtedly the favorite amateur waitress on this occasion, with the lively crowd of guests assembled around the big trestle tables set up in the museum. Her plump figure, irradiated by her love for her gentleman seducer, threw about her, wherever she went, a warm, amorous cloud of magnetic attraction. While her ready jest, as she carried the rabbits, pasties, and the pigeon pies and the great bowls of Irish stew, which were Penny's particular achievement, and which filled the museum with a fragrant, onion-heavy steam, from one or the other of the men and women seated round the table, were continually stirring fresh guffaws of laughter and causing various old gossips to nudge each other and wink as she pushed her way among them. The candles on the chimney-piece, as well as on the table, threw over all these faces a soft yellow glow that seemed to draw out something peculiarly individual from their folds and creases and wrinkles and heavy meaningless surfaces of flesh, all of which in daylight might have been inexpressive and insignificant. Every now and then Matt Dicker's eyes wandered to the old-fashioned pictures of his father and mother on the mantelpiece and to the faded, wistful picture of Sam's mother. These faces did not seem as alien to the scene that was going on as one would have suspected. But then all these vicar's guests, however ugly and deformed, possessed a certain winnowed quality of sensitiveness, which had come to them through their ancestors, common and gentle, down the long centuries of Glastonbury's life. Nowhere else, indeed, in the town that night, certainly not at the Pilgrims' Inn, and not even at St. Michael's Inn, was there assembled such a characteristic group of Glastonbury people. This accounted for the fact that towards the roof of Matt Dicker's house, through the hushed envelope of the earth's moonlit atmosphere, all manner of subhuman and superhuman influences were directed. Cold, mute, silent in the moonlight rose the tower arch of the ruined abbey. From the fields, fluted columns, from the foliated capitals, from the broken stone bases in the hushed grass, indestructible emanations of the wild liturgical call of the old tune, "Save us from eternal death! Save us from eternal death!" that these carved stones had known, vibrated forth over the smooth lawns, over the treetops, and then, floating away upon the moonlight, were attracted, as if by a lodestone composed of living souls, down into the hot, noisy, steamy, candlelighted room. Whew! Save us from eternal death! Save us from eternal death! This chant was wailed faintly above them all in that place, drifting through the high trees of King Edgar's lawn from those myriads of dead medieval throats. And mingled with the faint wailing, of which it was unlikely enough that any one among these revelers would catch the least echo, came a vast shadowy image. Between the moonlight and the vicarage roof it came, the image of the man-god of the West, the image of the being whose death by torture was to be celebrated that next day. It was as if the image, with those unspeakable eye sockets wherein quivered the death cries of all the victims of the cruelty of man and the cruelty of life, and the cruelty of the first cause, had been itself created by the impartible suffering of all sentient nerves from the zenith to the nadir of the physical universe. It brought with it, through this moonlit night, as it floated over the treetops, a terrible smell of pain. A smell that was sweet as burning sticks of cinnamon, a smell that was bitter as burning branches of laurel, a smell of a sponge soaked in the hyssop of a dead sea of anguish. But as none of this room noticed that cry above the roof, "Save us from eternal death," none noticed that floating image, none smelt that indescribable smell. In fact, the good, humble naturalist priest, who was the entertainer of this noisy gathering, and who, in the absence for the next 10 or 11 hours of his enemy the sun god, was so sturdily radiating about him his high spirits that everyone was conscious of some especial reassurance, decided now, while Emma, for that was her task, was carrying around numerous little cups of coffee to that more Epicurean of the guests, that it would be a good thing to have a little music. His first thought was of Tossie Stickles, who possessed a mandolin upon which she often played various little tones. Tossie had been so gay and lively during the first part of the evening that it was a shock to the good host that he learned from Sally Jones, whose blue eyes, as she came to confess it, was themselves blubbered with crying, that Tossie had been taken funny-like and been carried upstairs to rest. Mr. Decker's ruddy countenance lost in complacency, and an extremely anxious frown gathered upon his eyes. Tossie Stickles would never be taken funny as Squire Supper if there weren't something seriously amiss. That girl's in trouble, he said to himself, as sure as I'm a priest. Listen, Sally, he said gravely. Tell Tossie for me, when you're alone with her, that I'm not angry with her, and I'll talk to her before she goes. He still kept the young woman by his side with a penetrating stare from beneath his bushy eyebrows. But though he had spoken to her in a low whisper, their colloquy had not passed unobserved. Several of the older women had stopped sipping their coffee and were watching them intently. Run after her now, Sal. There's a good girl. And stay with her, will you? And pack all the others out of the room, won't you? But as soon as the girl had left the room, he shut his eyes tight and rubbed his face with the palm of his hands, uttering a faint, husky sound that was not exactly a groan, but which was near a groan. When he took his fingers away, he sighed heavily, drawing up that long breath from the depths of his broad chest, as if it had been a bucket of water out of a garden well. Well, I hope you take care, and I'll see you again in Glastonbury.